What I'm going to be talking about has really grown out of a research project that I was working on since, really between 2013 and 2016, which was looking at borders and what we call bordering across 22 different countries in Europe and bordering Europe. And it wasn't particularly focused, it wasn't at all focused on how Bangladeshis experience borders. Actually the stories of Bangladeshis became very important in the research as we were doing it, partly because with the kind of snowballing technique of interviewing that I was involved in, we ended up talking to quite a few British Bangladeshis. So what I've done today, because it's Bengal History Week and we're here, is just to pick out a few themes from our broader research which are specifically focused on UK Bangladeshis, but drawing on the kind of, some of the overall arguments of our work. And because it's Bengal History Week, I'm also going to have a specifically kind of historical beginning to the talk. And I hope it's not going to be really confusing, because I put various kind of things together. But anyway, ask me if it is. So it's from this research project, but it's also because I'm thinking of trying to write something which is very specifically around some of these issues and Britain's what I call bordering relationship with Bengal. So I'm going to start off by just talking about what we mean by borders and bordering, and then I'm going to go into some of the historical examples, and then I'm going to look at some recent UK bordering legislation and its impact on British Bangladeshis, and that's just drawing on some of the interviews that I did, and I'm sure that what I'm going to be talking about there is going to be very familiar to everybody in the room, whether or not you would put yourself in the category of British Bangladeshi. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the kind of link between bordering and hierarchies of belonging. So the top picture is just to illustrate some of the kind of bit about the historical theme. So that is the gate, the entrance to what was the East India Dock. What's interesting about that was the docks were surrounded by very high walls, and that was the only entrance in and out of those docks. So that in itself was a type of border back in the end of that picture was taken at the end of the sort of the turn of the century kind of time. And what I like about that is the masts of the ships that are actually quite far inland, where the East India Dock Road ends now. So this is the book that's at the front, which is a lot of the research has gone into that. And so I really need to explain a little bit about what we mean by bordering. And the significant thing is that we're shifting the word from being a border, talking about a line or a thing, a division, a territorial division, to being a process and something that people do to other people. People take the process of bordering other people. And what our overall argument is in the book is that borders and borderings have moved from the margins, so from those kind of territorial borders, wherever they were, into the centre of political and social life. And that's really what we're focusing on. And although I've put this statement here, is that bordering is redefining how we understand citizenship, identity, and also belonging. It affects both majorities, like the white majority in the UK, but also different racialized minorities. So when we talk about bordering, we're saying that it affects everybody. It doesn't just affect, so I'm talking about British Bangladeshis, it doesn't just affect British Bangladeshis. So when we talk about the territorial border, we often talk, we're usually talking about that line that goes around a state, but of course, especially if you're from Bangladesh, you know it's much more, or Pakistan, you know it's much more complicated about that, about where a border actually is. And I've just put up here an example of something that happened at the juxtaposed border. It's something that's happened to the MP Tulip Sadiq, who everybody here knows. It's also something, exactly the same thing has happened to me. When you go through that border, and if you're a woman and if your surname is a different surname to the child, you get questioned about whether or not that child is yours. And if you have some sort of, a mixed relationship, the likelihood of that questioning taking place seems to be much higher. But I've just put that up as an example of somebody who's from a very elite background, both in Bangladesh and in here, but who also herself found that she was being questioned about the relationship of her daughter to her as she crossed that border. But that's just that's actually not what I'm going to be talking about in detail. But it's just to illustrate that when you cross a border, who you are changes your experience of the border. It's a very simple point. It's kind of quite obvious. People know when you arrive at the UK border, you get into different queues, but then how you're treated in those different queues also can differ according to who you are. But I'm going to move from that because I want to talk about what's been happening with these borders becoming less important and bordering as a process that takes place inland becoming continuously more significant. So the UK since 2014 has been developing more and more extreme measures of bordering, bringing the border into everyday life. And it's not just about controlling people who might be identified as illegal migrants. I'm talking about what we all now know is talk about as the hostile environment, but also in our imaginations about the UK as being a desired space for immigration. And I think many of us here in the sort of, throughout the 80s and 90s, we felt that there was a group of people, and we were part of whether it's a movement or whatever, of thinking that Britain was developing as a sort of convivial multicultural society, and we were just going to be going on and on and on and moving in that direction. But since this introduction of bordering, which I'm going to explain as the hostile environment, that's actually being threatened as each of us becomes responsible for carrying out bordering. We're actually acting as everyday border guards. We're checking the immigration status of our fellow citizens, and they're checking ours as well. But how that happens depends on who you are. So this slide is just kind of like justifying and defining everything, but the important thing is really the point that I've already made about bordering being a process, something that we do to each other, but that it's always about distinguishing between the us and the other and the them, about deciding who's allowed to be in and who has to be out, who can cross border and who can't. But that this deterritorialized border, this border that can take place in all different sections of our everyday life, has just become much more central. So moving from Tulip Sadiq to somebody that I've called Samir, who is so it's not his real name, but he's an example of somebody that I interviewed. So a Bangladeshi young man who is now living in the US, but followed a very familiar path of college in Bangladesh, then applying, coming here, studying as a student, having to negotiate immigration compliance throughout his experience of going to university, but also experiencing the internal border in so many different aspects of his everyday life living in the UK. So, for example, being raised, I did one interview with him, and he spoke. These were some of the examples that he'd spoken about. So, within his accommodation, just being at home, being raided by the border force, based on a suspected malicious report by a neighbour who thought that his family had stolen a package that had been delivered at their house. Working in a shop in Whitechapel, and then experienced being raided there during Operation Skybreaker, which took place in 2014, when, I won't go into that in detail now, people here might remember Operation Skybreaker then. He had friends who were threatened with, they didn't want to be deported, so after several of the colleges were being closed a few years ago, they had to leave and go to different parts of Europe. He was getting married to a US citizen in the UK and experienced so much questioning and a huge culture of disbelief that the whole process became extremely difficult and unhappy. So, and it wasn't only him who was experiencing all these different bordering processes, but it was also his cousins, uncles, friends, and everything. So it was much broader than just him. So I'm just using him as an example who, in so many different aspects of their life, somebody who is here completely legally and has got family who are British citizens was just experiencing this bordering. And I'm putting that there to just compare it to like somebody like me who, or people who might have migrated from other parts of the world who just have not experienced the same kind of level of being the target of these bordering processes in different aspects of their life. And before I go on and talk about everyday bordering now and the legislation from 2014 and 2016 which has brought it into our lives, and because it's Bengal History Week, I want to just raise a few points about the histories of bordering in Britain's relationship with Bengal. And again, I'm sure that people here are very familiar with a lot of this, but I think it's important to make the link between what's been happening over the past 200 years, which is often quite invisible in the way that people talk about immigration now, with this kind of private citizen bordering that's been taking place to the extent that it has since 2014, 2015. So, of course, I've got a picture of the docks here because, as you might have guessed, I'm going to talk about the people who sail the ships. So, I'm starting by looking at the maritime bordering histories and the way that Indian seafarers, since the 1700s, really towards the end of the 1700s, were increasingly discriminated against in terms of their being allowed to settle in the UK. So during that period, at different times and in different places, there were different proportions of seafarers from the Indian subcontinent working in British ships, and I think everybody here is aware of that. And at particular times, the proportion of those men were more likely to be from the area of current-day West Bengal, and particularly from Bangladesh. It's too complicated for me to go into the detail of that at the moment, but the point that I'm making here is the consistency of the maritime legislation in ensuring that working class South Asian seafarers who were arriving in Britain on British ships and could make up to 25% of the numbers of people working for the British Mercantile Marine, and on some ships would be much more than 25% of the actual people, how they were not allowed to settle in Britain and what was in place to make sure that they were sent back to the Indian subcontinent. So, so the mechanism that was used was was the contracts that they were given, which meant that the shipping companies were obliged, when they were here, to house them separately, and to make sure that they were sent back, either working or not working, back to the ships, where the ports in the Indian subcontinent where they boarded the ships. During that time, people were jumping ship and people were deserting, in the same way that it was happening where the European sailors would get off the ships in different parts of the world. And what I'm doing here is I'm talking about desertion as border crossing. That's what it was, because it was something which was theoretically illegal for them to do, and yet the only way that they could get contracted on the British the same contracts as the European sailors was to land up in Britain and then try and get re-employed from Britain. And even though supposedly they were not allowed to settle, there's plenty of evidence, as we know from people like Rosina Visram and others, about the small communities of South Asians who were growing up around the East End over a long period of time. So the border was in the ship in that way, but once the Indian seafarer was on shore, his body became the border, in the sense that he was immediately obvious as somebody who shouldn't be here according to the law at that time, and that there were various surveillance agencies and the police who were monitoring the activities of Indian seafarers in the UK at different times, which I'm not going to go into the detail of now. So there's this quote from an officer from the British India Steam Navigation Company, which became part of P&O and which was the one that recruited people mainly from Calcutta, talking about deserters being involved in the preparation of food. And then there was other forms of bordering that were happening as well, through, as I said up there, that the National Union of Seamen and port authorities tried to check with the Asian boarding house keepers, check about desertions, that any Indian could be arrested on suspicion of desertion. And also the Seafarers Union wanted to exclude Asian seafarers through advocating language tests, which is quite interesting considering that they didn't need to speak English on the ships. But that was obviously because of the interests of the seafarers, the white seafarers unions at that time. So the historical element then is that there's been this kind of public-private bordering going on over a couple of centuries through this kind of maritime route. So you've got the legislation going through Parliament, which was prohibiting the settlement of Asian seafarers in the UK. Plus, you have at different times and in different ways again the shipping companies also either wanting to work against that because it was cheaper for them to employ Asian seafarers, or going hand in hand with the government, P&O in particular, to make sure that they would go out and catch anybody who was seen as deserting. So that's just some of the sort of historical side of it. And this is just some figures to just indicate the number of South Asian seafarers, some of whom would have been from present-day Bangladesh. And there's been quite a lot written within sort of labour history around the subject of mobility and containment, mobility and confinement, about how the laws throughout this period were aimed at making sure that South Asian seafarers did not settle in Britain, but also in some of the other white settler colonies. There's a very famous case, I don't know if anybody here knows about the hulk that was put in the Royal Albert Docks by P&O, and that was used as a way to house Indian seafarers and make sure they didn't land and they didn't go and mix with local people or start working in any of the local industries. But as is always the case with borders and bordering, as Hislop here has said, is that the colonial state actually leaked like an old rowing boat. So they were continually trying to contain and police the sailors, but it never really worked. So there was another type of bordering that was going on, which was actually on the ship. So in terms of the pay that the Indian seafarers got in relation to the white seafarers, that was the different contracts that they were on. So the Indian seafarers in 1939, for example, earned significantly less than the white. You can see £9 versus £1. Their food, space and clothing allowances were also worse than white sailors. And this led to them going on strike for equality right at the beginning as war was declared at the end of 1939. And that immediately led to 400 Indian seafarers being imprisoned at the end of 1939 for that strike. And then throughout the war, there were desertions happening, some which were being reported and some that weren't. But this is just a report from an estimate from an MI5 officer in 1943. So just to say that, all of this was being monitored in some way. An example of one Bangladeshi man's experience of bordering is Haji Sirajul Islam, who's one of the men interviewed in Caroline Adams's oral histories of Sylheti seafarers. So he told his story about jumping ship, about crossing the border in 1937 because he wanted to improve his employment he wanted to earn some money rather than earn almost no money. But then once the war started, the wages went up, so he went back onto the ships, and because he'd been working in the UK, he managed to go on the British articles and get paid more. He went back and forth, and then he jumped ship again because of being badly treated by the engineer. And then he was threatened with prison, but managed to escape. And then he followed that familiar path of having left the ship, crossed the border during wartime, was able to find work, and then eventually become part of an early member of the British Bangladeshi community. And he was actually one of the founding members of the Pakistan Caterers Association, which became the Bangladesh Caterers Association. And was very successful in the restaurant trade. The reason that I put that up there is just because it illustrates that so-called illegal border crossing in the past in the UK could lead to, within a generation or over a certain period of time, some sort of assimilation or becoming part of the great, this, as I spoke about earlier, this sort of multicultural, convivial community that some of us hoped that was developing in the UK until some of the more recent legislation. So another thing, something that we did in our research was to interview some Bangladeshi people who had experienced this person was deported back to Bangladesh, to get them to talk about their own family histories in terms of having had grandparents who had been in the Merchant Navy, so who had been subject to some of this border legislation through the Merchant Marine before. So we interviewed somebody who is called Shaheen here, whose grandfather had been in the British Merchant Navy in the Second World War, and who had at the end of the war, he had worked here for a bit, and then he'd gone back to Bangladesh, and he'd set up a couple of schools and and then he basically just got involved in life in Sylhet, in Bangladesh. But when his grandson got into political difficulties, and what I should have said was that he went back and he never bothered to claim any British citizenship. But when his grandson got involved in some political difficulties, he had no, it shouldn't be obviously, but he had no right to claim any reason to be able to come back to the UK, even though he had this very long-standing relationship with the UK. So he came here illegally and lived in this very kind of in-between situation, and had loads of relatives who were supporting him in all sorts of different ways. But he ended up being arrested and having to leave the country because of the way that the legislation has, the reason that he got caught is because of the hostile environment legislation, which I'm going to talk about now, and which wasn't around when people of his grandfather's generation, or Shirajul Islam, had been around. So, I'm now going to leave the historical side and look at what's been happening in the present and how the way that bordering has moved into everyday life now is affecting British Bangladeshis that we spoke to when we were doing this research. So when we talk about borders up until 2014, we didn't necessarily think about the houses that we live in, or we didn't necessarily think about the GP or the hospital. But those are very much at the centre of the immigration control now. And that's really from 2014 right the way through. Well, because of Brexit, there hasn't been any new immigration legislation going through. But since 2014, there's been more and more legislation which has been making what we call unpaid bordering responsibilities central to our own role as citizens. So even us as citizens, we have got an obligation to, if we're an employer, we've got an obligation to check the immigration status of the people we employ. If we're a landlord, we have to check the immigration status of people who we let properties to. So just to go through the impact of this, which is really huge if you're looking from the perspective of somebody like Samir early on. So in 2014, the Immigration Act was really Theresa May introducing what she called the hostile environment for non-EEA, non-European Union migrants in the UK who are working illegally. Under Theresa May, they increased the penalties for employers who've employed people illegally. They introduced the laws for landlords having to check the immigration status of any adult who was living in their property, NHS surcharge for people coming on various visas, being able to revoke driving licenses, restricting bank accounts, which has meant that people that we know who previously, for example, had quite happily got out mortgages using slightly different names because their passport names hadn't been quite the same as the names on their other documents, now having difficulties, and making it harder for people to get married through, meaning that there's now 70 days that the Border Force can use to investigate a marriage if they suspect that it's a sham marriage. I'll talk about that a bit more later. And then the 2016 Immigration Act just moved it further. So they said that if you're an illegal worker, then what you earn is proceeds of crime, so it can be seized. And they just made the penalties greater for employers and for private landlords. And they made it possible to criminalise some landlords as well, etc., etc. So I'm just going to now have a look at some of the responses and impacts from Bangladeshi people from mainly from East London, who we spoke to, about the impact of this border being brought into everyday life. And just remember that the whole kind of like takeaway from this is about ordinary citizens being made into border guards, but ordinary citizens not being paid to be professional border guards. So whereas if you're working at the border in a paid job, you might at least you might be obliged not to be shown to be discriminating against somebody, but that's not necessarily the case if you're just a private person doing it in your own space. So I interviewed this person who was a small business manager, and he was talking about the impact of these policies on him. So he's saying it's not only about this. He was really talking about all of the divisions that it's making in society, and particularly, he says it's not just about white indigenous people. He said it could be one of my friends who's fallen out with me if he knows that I somehow employ one person just to harass me. So the Home Office are trying their best not to make a cohesive society, although they preach for this. They're trying to employ people as police against each other. They're creating a situation of chaos in the society. And I interviewed, I don't know if anybody here knows Dr Rashid, who's a very successful restaurateur, and he spoke about how the suspicion placed on employers was making life real hell for restaurateurs. And I don't know if any of you would ever look at the Home Office, it used to be called Akbar, the UK Border Agency website, but every week they just used to list the number of raids that they did in restaurants all around the country, and they would talk about the number of Bangladeshis or the number of Pakistanis or the number of Vietnamese who they had taken from each of those restaurants. And of course, they wouldn't ever say how many of them were actually here illegally. They would just talk about the number who had been arrested. So Bajla Rashid was very angry because he said that it's actually being used as a form of revenue collection to fine the employers, and that they don't really want to sort out the problem of illegal immigrants. He felt that it was the owners who were being targeted. And one of the reasons that, and he was also very upset about the fact that the raids were always done at the weekend, which is, from the Border Force point of view, is because that's when they would think that most people who are working illegally would be working. But from the businessman's point of view, that was when most of the customers were there. So huge disruption to restaurant trade. And that was linked also to the fact that at the same time, visas were not being given to people to come from Bangladesh and other parts of the subcontinent to work here legally. So on the one hand, it's been very hard to recruit chefs and people who are actually willing to work in the restaurants, which is why there was a demonstration several years ago in Trafalgar Square against the restrictions on visas. But then on the other hand, restaurants are getting raided because of the suspicion of them employing people who are here illegally. If anybody's interested, we made a film about everyday borders, and there's the link. If you just Google everyday borders, you can have a look, and there's the interview with Bajla Rashid in that video. So we also talked to restaurant workers in this area, and shop owners and people who worked in shops. And one of the things that we spoke about, that they talked about in great detail, was Operation Skybreaker. Does anybody here know what Operation Skybreaker was? It was a border force program that took place over a 6-month period where the border force would go. They chose 9 different wards in London. One of them was Whitechapel, and they would go around every single business in Whitechapel and check that the employers had the correct paperwork for everybody that they were employing. And then they called that an engagement visit. And then they would follow those up with raids where they thought that, in fact, they ended up raiding lots of people, whether they had suspicions or not. But they said if they had suspicions, then they would follow that up with raids. And we talked to people who'd experienced the raids in Whitechapel. And what this guy is saying is that, I mean, he was raided, and the shop was surrounded, and all the customers were in the shop, and they were terrified. People on the street were stopped. But what he was really worried about was the fact that he was employing people who had a visa from an identity card from the EU, but he felt that he was no longer confident to employ those people. So, for example, there's a lot of Italian Bangladeshis who've come here who might be using their Italian ID, but there's also a suspicion about that because people say that the Italian ID can be forged, etc. So what he would do now was he would only employ people who have got the most, obvious correct immigration status. So he ends up actually discriminating against people who are actually legally able to work, but he doesn't want to risk being raided, or he doesn't want to risk being fined, so he doesn't employ those people. And the betting shop manager as well, who also experienced being raided when he was in there, and he was really angry and upset because it was a big, I think it must be William Hill. It says that just says William Hill, but whichever it was, they kept all of the paperwork in the head office, which was apparently the incorrect thing to do, but so therefore the Border Force didn't believe that anybody in the betting shop were working there legally, so they were all kept in there for a long time as well. So that was really bad experience, and people were having their ID checked, and obviously it made people feel really humiliated. But not as humiliated as people who experience the border through getting married, and I mean it's the most humiliating thing, which I think lots of people, not just from Bangladesh, but with mixed relationships or with not mixed relationships from so many different parts of the world, where you have to demonstrate to the people in the registry office that you're undergoing a genuine marriage. And the quote at the top is taken from the Home Affairs Select Committee, looking into sham marriages, and that kind of sums up really the way that I heard quite a lot of people talking about what could be a very sort of intimate experience. So you may be able to tell at a glance whether there is a sham marriage going on. Obviously, if it's Beauty and the Beast, one can make a judgment. What should registrars be doing to tell? This idea that a registrar can just, tell by the physical appearance the people who are getting married about whether it's genuine or not is really unpleasant. So without going into too much detail, during 2014 there was a kind of moral panic about people from the EU bringing in partners from outside the EU because it's easier to do that. David, I know that you're not going because you're not really interested, because you've got to go. Okay, bye. Sorry, he told me that he was going to have to go after. So there was a panic because it's much easier for an EU national to bring a partner from outside the EU than it is for a British person to bring a partner from outside the EU. So if you're British, you have to show that you're earning at least £18,600 to bring in your partner. Whereas if you're an EU citizen, you wouldn't have to do that. So the Home Office and everybody was really worried about that, and they were particularly worried, as you can see here, that if an national can bring in their partner, they can then bring in their dependent children and grandchildren and dependent parents and grandparents. And the people that they were most worried about were people from Britain's ex-colonies. So people from Nigeria, Ghana, Pakistan, Bangladesh were the focus. So what they were doing with all of this stuff about sham marriages during that time was checking out any marriage that was happening between a Portuguese person and an Indian person, or a Spanish person and a Bangladeshi person, and making huge judgments about whether that was a genuine relationship or not. And I went along, I interviewed some registrars, and one of them got out a list, and she said, look, this is my tally. And she kept every kind of mixed relationship combination. She did a tally, like, there's 3 Afghanis married to Lithuanians or something, and then made these very sort of stereotyping comments about why people would be in relationships with other people, which didn't really seem to have any understanding of the kind of living in London, what that can actually mean for the people that you meet. So, for example, we interviewed Kurdish people who were married to Estonians because they'd worked in the same factory, or Pakistani people married to Romanians because they'd been at college together. These kinds of things. So that was why there was a scare about EU citizens getting married to people from Bangladesh, for example. But then sort of just going back to the more ordinary experience of British Bangladeshis, who, as I'm sure everybody knows here, have had so many stories of marriages which have been really difficult to get organised. I'm not talking about like arranged in that sense, but of getting everybody together from different parts of the world in order to have a marriage ceremony in the UK, and how these kind of investigations could really impact on that. And this person says here, the aim being to force British, it's not that they're stopping illegal immigration, but in the name of it, they're stopping legal immigration. That's through sorry, I didn't go through that quickly enough, but at that time, there was a lot of, in 2014, 2015, there was a lot of focus on TV programs and various other things about phoning up and reporting suspected sham marriages. And I just wanted to talk about that from the perspective of somebody who actually conducts a marriage ceremony, because I'm talking about how even those of us who are not the targets of this immigration legislation, we still become implicated in it in ways that we might not like. So it's not just about the employer checking the immigration status of somebody they're employing, but also what's it like for a religious person, for a church minister, who in the past, their first question when somebody came wanting to get married was, I'm here to help, and congratulations and everything. And now that's moved on to it all being about immigration. The first question has to be, are you legally allowed to be in this country, before they would go on and conduct the marriage. Now, that's actually changed now, because now all marriages have to go through the registrar and border force first. But there was a time when the church minister would be in that in-between position of having to make the decision himself or herself. So I talked about marriage and employment. So accommodation is the other one which I think has been most shocking to people, and where there has immediately been showing up a huge amount of discrimination taking place. So, as all of us know, London has got an extremely hot property market. It's really hard to rent somewhere, let alone somewhere that you can afford. And you now need to prove that you're legally in this country. And that's fine if you've got all the right paperwork, But if you haven't got all the right paperwork, or if it's, if you've had ongoing cases, etc., it can be, a landlord is not going to understand your documents, and they will, in this kind of hot property market, they will give the property to somebody whose documents they can easily see are the correct ones. So, although here, as I'm saying, a landlord's not technically breaking the law by taking the person who's got the passport and everything ready for them, in effect they're discriminating against people who don't have those pieces of paper. And the JCWI has done some really good evaluations of the scheme and found how landlords have been discriminating against people on that basis. They just want to take the easiest route. I missed that one. I won't go into detail about this because I've been going on a bit long. But education is another area where people working in higher education have had to check the immigration status of their students. They've had to monitor their students in those institutions, and the universities themselves have had to have very strict compliance. It's quite complicated, so I'm not going to detail it now, but the point of this slide is to show that people working at some of the newer universities, which have a higher number of overseas students, find that they are being monitored much more closely by the Home Office than those at the more elite Russell Group universities. And I spoke to a college administrator who was a little bit like the church minister, in that he was really upset that, when he's from a British Bangladeshi background, that his first question when people used to come to college was, what do you want to study? But now it's about their immigration status, because he would be the person who would be threatened with possibly losing his job if he took on students who weren't in the country legally. So this just brings me to the Windrush Scandal. So I think everybody here is familiar with the Windrush Scandal, and the question about Windrush is, why now? So, as you know, people were finding that they were suddenly not British when they thought that they had been British all their lives. And the reason that happened, when it happened, is because of this legislation from 2014. So, without having a passport, it was possible to work, rent, go to university, and basically live your life in the same way that Shurajul Islam had when he'd jumped ship back in 1942 or whenever he'd done that. But once all of these policies came into place, people who thought they were British, and indeed people who were British, or people who had the right to remain in this country, were deported, threatened with deportation, not allowed hospital treatment, lost their housing, lost their jobs, etc., etc. And I'm sure that if I went to rent a property and I didn't have a British passport with me, probably the landlord would be quite happy to lend the property to me. But for many of those people, obviously that wasn't the case. So this then just brings me on to the final part of this, where I'm talking about belonging. So what the Windrush Scandal showed all of us was how people who thought they were British and who were British had that taken away so easily. And the focus was very much on people from the Caribbean at the time, but it's not just about people from the Caribbean. I found this article in the Dhaka Tribune about, and I don't know this person at all, I know nothing about this person apart from what was in the newspaper, about Azad Mia, who came to Britain in 1972, and obviously had been living here okay, and then he tried to organise his wife's burial in Bangladesh, but he didn't have, he must have been just using, before that, his old Bangladeshi passport. He hadn't done any biometric residency permit, and then he was told that he might not be able to re-enter the UK if he left on the basis of an old UK residency stamp, and therefore he couldn't get a job. And then when the publicity about the Windrush Scandal came up in reference to people from the Caribbean, he realised that he was in a really similar position. And in fact, just going through this, people who are categorised as being part of the Windrush generation who could be affected in these ways includes the 29,000 others, which can include Bangladeshis. So, just to finish off, I've been talking about borders and bordering. I've talked about how the borders have moved into everyday life, how bordering is a verb because all of us are kind of implicated as everyday border guards, and that is what we refer to as the hostile environment. But they've renamed the hostile environment now. Haji, Javid, etc. have said, no, it's not the hostile environment anymore, it's the compliant environment. And I don't know what they mean by that. But obviously there's a lot of people who are arguing against it now, and we wait to see what happens in relation to that. We don't know what the immigration legislation is going to be post-Brexit. But I think it's really important that everybody is aware that this is the direction that it's been going on. And when people talk about the border in Northern Ireland, the border between the Republic and the North, and they talk about having flexible, seamless borders, actually part of what they're talking about is moving the border away from that line and into everybody's everyday life. And is that actually what people want? So those are just questions. There's lots of fighting back, as we can see. Doctors' surgery is making it clear that they aren't actually allowed to demand to see a passport when people go into a doctor's surgery, although some doctor's surgery do ask. There's lots more to say about all of that, but I will finish now because I can see I've been speaking for too long.
Thank you, Georgie. I'm not going to go in chair and just interact with Georgie.
Or not. Yeah, obviously you did some research on this, obviously. That's why you got so much knowledge about this, and your book as well. And I was wondering, Windrush, when the hostile environment started, I think Theresa May was the Home Secretary. She was Home Secretary, and Home Secretary post generally last for 2 years. Very hostile environment itself, Home Secretary. So she lasted for 6 years there. And everything she started it. Her kind of, and then ongoing, became a prime minister, which left us in the mess now. So ongoing saga, Theresa May is still going on. But when the Windrush issue was very highlighted in the press, because it was a predominant black issue, Jamaican, Afro-Caribbean, and it was very much focused on the media. Every day there was a news about it. And I remember Salita has publicly apologized in Parliament for that. And I mean, I didn't go into detail, and I understand that they are looking for people in Jamaica to find out who actually they send them, bring them, and compensate them on all this. So I mean, obviously this, because I don't know, I mean, it was a Jamaican issue, particularly everybody knows Windrush in Jamaica, but a Caribbean issue. So it is a high thing. I mean, and I think they won their struggle. Everybody, Windrush was deported. They won their struggle and they came back and they received their compensation. Obviously, that was a good thing. I mean, but in terms of Asia and Bangladesh, you said 29,000 people other affected. I don't know how they were treated, but they were differently. I mean, inside information, I don't know. And the other thing is obviously hostile environment is. I mean, was obviously one thing you didn't talk about is, I think, is even if you, like for instance, if I get married in Bangladesh, I earn £18,000 and bring my wife.
Yeah.
After 5 years, she will get British passport.
Yeah.
Before it was 1 year when I got my wife. And British citizen fees was, I remember when I came, which I came in 75, so long time ago, I paid £155 fees for British citizenship. Now, I mean, I'm not up to date with the fees, but I understand up to £5,000 it could cost you to get British citizenship now, legally. I mean, there was a recently a report I saw in the news. I mean, it published about £400, like casework needs to be put in to complete this whole process. And when people are paying £5,000, so this is something which is, I mean, it's a money-making machine basically. And these are issues are not highlighted properly. I mean, 5,000 person for somebody. Like if I have 4 members family, I think that's £20,000. I mean, these are issues that are, I mean, ongoing issues, and nobody is really highlighting them because immigration, still fees. People obviously we are. This is one of the reasons why I have Brexit is immigration. I mean, to be honest, that's the main issue. And I mean, so these are just a statement I'm making. I'm not asking any question. And then recently, like obviously, although people like Boris or not, some people like it, but he has relaxed the rule on student education. 2 years people can, after their degree, they can stay here 2 years and work. That was a relaxed. Boris bought that immediately to sort of compromise with China, might be other India, particularly India. They want to deal with India, so Indian student, India kind of demanded those kind of things. So that was one thing. I mean, Boris also kind of suddenly, obviously he's a journalist. He can play the media. He said, I will 100,000 people. I will do a national amnesty. That's kind of it was in the paper, but maybe he's just playing a game for another issue. I want to just ask you is specifically about Priti Patel, for Home Minister now. She kind of, you know, the Bangladeshi catered registration. She kind of got them to support Brexit. One of the things she promised is if you support Brexit, then we'll bring more people from. We'll stop European and chefs and all these skilled people can come. I don't know that she's going to keep her promise. We'll have to see what they see. I mean, this is what a politician obviously do. So these are the kind of things which are, I mean, ongoing issues. And immigration, I mean, we say it used to be a big word. World is a global one. This is a global village on this. And since Trump came in, it's a protectionism. Like he protect your border. It's no longer a global village now. Or it's a border, enforced border. Everybody is enforcing everybody's border. Like not mass. Obviously, mass immigration is created by Europe basically. All the immigration, Europe not much. Europe is part of it, but America, all these people, Syrian people, if they started all this war in Middle East, like this Afghanistan or Afghan people, Syrian people, Iraqi people, Libyan people, like wouldn't come here. They were all okay. Well, they were under dictatorship, everybody knows. But they were settled there. So, I mean, you create a problem and then when it comes to your door, you want to shut it up. And this kind of, obviously, I mean, double standard policy is one of the Western countries is the best to do it. But mostly America, they do it double standard. And this is how they play the game. Which is a British, divide and rule. Like when British to rule, British, our countries. Divide and rule was one of their most important policy, and this is how they successfully run our country for 200 years. And these are the things which is happening, and it's just, I mean, okay. I mean, I see I mean, people coming in this country, but statistically showing people who come here, they pay tax, everything. You know, they are not a burden on the society. Financially, I know there was some big organization did statistics. Then they put in more than they take out. But general public will understand that when they say all these Polish people or Italian, Bangladeshi, everywhere, they wouldn't go into that detail. So these are things which needs to be sort of looked into. But I mean, unless you put a big campaign out, like mass protest or something, I mean, this will go under the carpet. And immigration is not open immigration is not in this country. It still is hostile to the general public. We want to keep our border.
Just one thing, you said before you could get passport in 1 year. I don't think that was possible. You used to get stamp.
No. When I came,
Right.
So now it's 5 years. But there was no, like I didn't have to go to like immigration, like home office to get a stamp for £1,000 every year. That system wasn't there. That is kind of introduced. And generally speaking, like language tests, all these things, I mean, you put a barrier. So many barriers you put, like you in order to stop, like so many barriers you can put. So if they fail one, then you stay out. So language test, all this is just a barrier. It's not actually, it doesn't work, you know. I mean, you don't need to speak much English to work in a warehouse or somewhere.
Yeah.
No language is needed. So these are things which are like, I mean, it's not going to be easier for people to live in this country, like even after we get Brexit, have Brexit, but maybe Boris has more of a like better picture than Theresa May of immigration.
Well, he wants cheap labour, doesn't he? Because, and if you, I mean, just looking all the way back to the historical, the seafarers, that all of that was about labour as well, about having cheap labour. And then now, I think Boris said the same thing when he was Mayor of London as well, that yes, we want to have an amnesty or whatever. But as soon as he doesn't want that labour, he'll just change it back again. So that's why I mean, I don't know whether you agree or not, but with the students, they're a tap that's so easy to turn it on and off. And say, yes, we want you, and then, no, we don't want you anymore.
It's different, but you know, when you get a degree person working here, obviously he will not work in a warehouse, he will pay proper tax. When you put proper tax back, like 40% tax you back to, when you go over 40,000, 50,000, you're paying 40% tax on your income. So only way this country will be generating money for them, you know. So it's not a bad thing, but obviously, like most 2 years for a student rule is maybe a good rule. I think it is at least something to begin with. State way opened up.
Yeah, it's definitely better than not. Yeah, no, thank you, and everything that you've said is completely, you know, I agree with completely, and it's, you know, it's part of it as and parts of that are what we're in the book as well. I mean, we're trying to bring it to the centre ground, and in a way, talking about borders and British Bangladeshis is not something to talk about with British Bangladeshis, because everybody's experienced it in so many different ways. But those kinds of struggles and histories are still something which is quite invisible to the rest of society. Like when I was talking about Operation Skybreaker, and people who were in Whitechapel were so aware of it, you know, Bangladeshi people have businesses or even in the streets or anything. I just went to Bethnal Green and started talking to white middle class people in Bethnal Green, and they didn't have a clue. It hadn't crossed their mind at all. And if you're a white middle class person, you're not going to be thinking about a landlord checking your immigration status, or you're the employer, so you're not going to be worrying about that either. And you're going to just cross the border. You get on at London City Airport where nobody hardly bothers to check you anyway, and you'll be fine. So it's partly about making what you're talking about visible as well. But thank you for all of those comments. Yes, sorry.
I'm sorry, I just wanted to thank you for your talk, but I just wanted, you talked about with the Windrush generation, so they went another cut, they're back again.
Yeah, I think so, might be.
No, they have. Yeah. They are allowed to come back again. But psychologically, what does that do to you? This is your home, and then you're told to get out. And then, okay, they say, oh, you made a mistake, you can come back now if you want to. But do you really see this place as your home? And
but it's,
I'm just thinking that,
yes,
where do I belong? I was born here, or I came here when I was a baby, and this is the only place I know. I've always thought of it as my home, but now they're telling me that I don't belong, and they've thrown me out, and
this is a psychological trauma.
And I'm thinking then about the whole terrorism thing, and then the British Asian, well, say the British Bangladesh, like the girls from that Bethnal Green school, they're British born, but they're not British. They're Bangladeshi. I mean, where do we belong? And what is this doing to the psychology of the brown-skinned, black-skinned people living in this country? That at the end of the day, you're never going to be British.
But I worry about my son. He's born here, obviously. And when you think about Shamima Begum, so she was born here. So.
But where was her allegiance?
Where is the border is? Because he hasn't got anything Bangladeshi. He's nearly 15 years old. So I mean, if something can happen to Shamima Begum, who's born here, brought up here, so her British citizen. I mean, we all agree she has done wrong. She should be punished. There is no question about that. But cutting her British citizenship is the wrong decision. Many politicians say it's the wrong decision. Jeremy Corbyn said it's the wrong decision.
What was British about her?
She was born here.
Is that it?
Yeah. Well, the most important thing a person. I mean, born
What makes a person?
No, I think. I mean, even this like national like the United Nations. There is a line United Nations says like person who was born there, he has the right to everything. Nobody can take him there. There is a rule on that. Like
my parents were born in India, right?
Yeah, but
in 1947
yeah.
they were forcibly removed. Okay, and then they went to Pakistan, and Pakistan gave them nothing. My parents had to migrate here for a living. So, and tomorrow, if the Punjab becomes independent, you know, they will not be Pakistani anymore. When Bangladesh was created, it was East Pakistan. It was East Pakistan. What did West Pakistan said? What did West Pakistan do to them? They said they went in and just finished it.
Yeah.
So where is your allegiance and what is your where is your home?
Whatever your allegiance is, that is not the issue when it comes to going on. No, these policies are like racist policies. But
Can I just interrupt?
Sorry.
Because Leslie had a question. So I had a question as well.
Yeah, I wanted to raise 2 or 3 issues or questions for you to not necessarily answer, but you might have some ideas. One is on the question of employment. My intuition, I don't have any evidence, is that British Bangladeshis who are working in big multinationals in what is called the gig economy, like Deliveroo, or Uber, or even McDonald's and KFC. I don't think immigration or the bordering is very visible there because big companies are not being harassed. I mean, it's the small companies that are being harassed. So you must, I'm sure, have evidence for that. Is my intuition right that that is what is happening? And the reason I say is because one of the unions, biggest union, they are involved in organizing workers who are on zero contract and things like that. And they are saying that immigration is not a big issue. But perhaps they're right. That's one point. The second is, if you look at migration within Europe in the 19th century, especially when big public works bridges, Eiffel Tower were happening, migrants were brought in. And what is your understanding in terms of what is happening now and what used to happen then, which was not necessarily based on race, but on us and the other. But was it very different, or is there something special that is happening now, which changes things? And in terms of Bangladeshis, is faith an issue there or not?
Is what?
Is faith an issue? Are they being targeted because they're Muslims?
Oh, I see. Faith.
Bangladeshis? And the final thing is, what is happening, and you mentioned a bit on that, is this is a worldwide phenomenon in the sense that, Kurds do not belong anywhere. They belong everywhere but nowhere. Muslims in India are in a different situation at the moment. And we know that Jews, where do they belong? I mean, this famous thing that they used to say that we belong where our suitcases are. Back up and go. So that is now again becoming an issue because of the rise of right-wing populism in Europe especially. And just a personal anecdote. I mean, I went for a visa, Indian visa, with a British passport, and they have questions like, where was your father born,
Oh,
mother
Yeah.
born,
Yeah.
grandfather born,
yeah.
and I dutifully wrote, India or Pakistan or British India, and then the clerk told me, don't write these things, simply write Bangladesh everywhere, otherwise you won't get a visa. You'll get a visa, but it will be delayed. The moment a worker sees Pakistan or British India, they'll put it in another tray and it will be 3 months, you'll get it, but you'll not get it quickly.
Yeah.
So there are the quirks and
Yeah.
ironies of
Yeah.
bordering, which is not invasive but very funny.
Yeah. Or can be. And I remember the first one was about Uber and the gig economy. That's quite interesting because if you're working for Uber, you have to have a driving license. So you're going to have been boarded in your application for the driving license, and that might not have been the case before. Now that's checked much more. So I guess for Uber it doesn't make any difference. As long as someone's got a driving license, they can work for them. But I suppose you don't know whether they're using their own driving license or somebody else's driving license, but we don't know that in so many other cases as well. I think what you said about they're targeting the small restaurants and nothing. Do you remember the Byron case? So Byron, the burger chain, they actually worked hand in hand with the border force, and they set up what they called health and safety training for their employees, who they knew that many of them were living in these kind of in-between sort of situations. And they did that hand in hand with the border force, and then the border force just went in and did mass arrests of Byron workers. And Byron, is a company which is part of something much bigger, and so it wasn't one of these small kind of what people called like ethnic enclave economy businesses. So that's one example. For things like Deliveroo, I don't know because I don't know. It's interesting. That'd be interesting to know for some of those other ones. That was your first point. What was the second one?
The third one was, the second one was about what happened in the 19th century.
Oh yeah.
And now, because lots of people were brought in, which is inter-Europe.
So I think that links with, because of, obviously there's lots of different arguments about what's happening with globalization, the rise of right-wing populism in so many different states, and that being associated with increase in bordering in different ways in different countries. So our book is not just based on Britain and not just based on Bangladesh. And we see it in so many different ways. So, for example, in the US, we can see on the Mexico border, people getting arrested for traffic offences, hundreds of miles away, and then having the police go through everything, and then finding that they're, illegal from 15 years ago, and then getting reported. And that's something that didn't used to happen either there. In France, the restrictions being placed on people helping migrants to move, people being, arrested or prosecuted, both at the border with Italy, and then at one stage, was it under Sarkozy, they introduced a law where even if you helped a migrant in your house, that was illegal, and then they got rid of that law quite soon afterwards. So there's a tightening both at the border, where you've got, we've got the Hungary, razor wire on the Hungarian border, and then the tightening of the legislation inside. But I think the fact that in the UK, we've never had ID cards has also...
They were trying to bring them in though.
Yes, and
And there was a big
biometric
campaign
cards
for-
now are like ID cards for anybody who's not British. And what's going to happen with ID cards? But that's slightly changed the relation. But people moved.
You can't do anything in Bangladesh now without ID cards.
And in
But
India,
what I was
yeah,
trying to
yeah.
understand is what happened in the 19th century in terms of the migrants, that experience, historical experience, how that match up with what happened after the Second World War or from the Second World War?
I just don't I mean, I'm not. You've probably read more about this than I have,
No,
but it's about a tightening. It's about, you know, some of these processes I was showing historically with the marine legislation. So the idea about the ship being about containment and about confinement. When people on the ship, they could be controlled, but as soon as they got to the port, they couldn't be controlled. That's when it would become permeable, and then people were able to leave and somehow or other melt into wherever, or get on a ship that was going to US and escape the British Empire completely by jumping ship when they got to the US. So it was just much more possible with less centralised governments, and the disruptions that were happening that you were just talking about as well in the 19th century and in the 20th century as well. Because that story of Shiraj ul-Islam jumping ship and then, you know, just being able to work because labour was needed here, must have been repeated all over.
And I just, I mean,
Yeah.
I think, you know, from policy perspective, you know, the policies were kind of demand-led. So, you know, the analogy used earlier on, you know, tap on and off.
Yeah.
So post-Second World War, you know, because of the increased demand for labor, you know, they opened up, you know, and it is in a different guise. You know, we have got, you know, those tiers, you know, tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, you know, they're quite happy, you know, to bring, you know, skilled labor, but not unwanted ones. So there are some changes, but it is probably important to recognize that it was often demand-led, you know.
But also there weren't such thing as passports until the First World War, around the First World War. So
between First and Second World War, there was another impetus, you know, we want you know, that poster, you know, to recruit, you know, to the army and so on.
But I think as the public sector is becoming more and more strained, you know, if the migrants didn't need social housing, if they didn't need to use the NHS, if they didn't need to send their kids to school, then it'd be fine. And if all they did was work till they dropped and then they just got buried, that'd be fine. But they're demanding housing, they're demanding so many things, and of course a lot of the things that the unskilled labour can do, machines can do. So, you know, and more machines are doing it.
yeah.
And what about the working class, unskilled white people? They're sitting on benefits. They want people to get off the benefits. To get off the benefits and do what?
Yeah.
The other thing is, you know, this rule about like landlord checking people's paper and the employer checking people's paper. Because I worked in the silent team 5 years in town social services. So we used to check people's paper because asylum paper needs to be done. That's a requirement. And there are so many different type of stamp and so many in the passport. So many things. Like we used to go for training before you can recognize which is what. So this mess people, giving this responsibility to mess people without training, without any leaflet. You check the passport. You are border control now. I mean that I mean I don't know that is full. I mean I don't think nobody has been prosecuted for not checking. There is no case law here on that.
No, but the fact is it's there. But the other thing is that it's not just about the checking, it's that they have to keep a copy. And what that does about identity theft. Why should I give a copy of my passport?
This is a requirement, I know that is.
And it has an implication for, you know, social inclusion, community cohesion, the ways in which we relate to others as well. I teach in a university and I invite one of my teachers, my own teacher, you know, for a guest lecture. This is so embarrassing. Every year I invite her. You know, I'll have to ask her passport and she will have to give a photocopy of the passport. So I invite her every year. So last year I said to the HR department that, you know, she has got passport at least photocopy, you have got a photocopy of a passport, in your file. I'm not going to ask her again. They said that you'll have to do that. And she was not getting paid, only a tiny bit of money, for 3 hours a session, and I said, that's not the honest. And it was so embarrassing to ask her again, and then I lied. I said that I have seen it. I have seen it. In a way, I have seen it in the past, but how can I ask her again that I need to see your passport and you'll
But
bring
more
your passport?
and more of us, that's what we have to do, because otherwise we're just complying with agreeing to be border guards. So when it's a stupid thing like that.
No, exactly. But it kind of, this point actually relates to what Sister was saying, about, policy objective of social cohesion, how do we actually relate to each other? If it is a major and overarching policy objective, that we need to have an equal relationship. We are all of equal worth. We are all equal citizens.
Yeah, but it's
This bordering
basically an estate agent down the road who is not registered, who might not be taking your passport copy, everything, your identity. He even himself the compliance work. And you're giving everything to him. And data protection, all this. Data protection will probably, if somebody actually use the Data Protection Act, like I'm giving this, can I see his full regulation under which he is checking this? Nobody has been challenged that. So data protection can be used for landlord. What is he going to do? Is he a thief? What?
Yeah, and
What
there's
is inhuman is
Yeah.
the assumption that you are guilty.
exactly.
That is what is
Absolutely. That was one of your points in earlier on. This is, in French Revolution or in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, there was a word, presumption of innocence. Somebody is innocent until they are proven guilty. But now the reality is you prove that you are automatically guilty. So you prove that you are not guilty. So it is it goes against the spirit of Universal Declaration of Human Rights as well as, other, human rights declaration before that.
But also, I'll just bring in that because this is from a landlord, and she's saying, what she was saying was that by law I'm not going to be able to rent the flat to a vulnerable tenant, and I think that's an infringement of my rights. So she wanted to give her flat to maybe a woman asylum seeker or somebody who was escaping domestic violence who was then threatened with deportation. But if she does that, she's breaking the law. So it's an infringement on her rights, you could say her property rights.
She can still do that though. She doesn't need to tell anyone.
Yeah, she can.
But in Britain, I don't know whether it's still the case or not, there used to be people, libertarians, who would not fill out census reports.
Yeah.
Census because I can't give my name or anything.
Yes.
I don't know whether it still exists or not, whether people do that or not.
I don't know about it.
But we have come from
Yeah.
there to a position
Yeah.
where you have to give everything.
Yeah, exactly. And people have got to start kind of questioning it and not just going along with it. And I think since 2014, I think people were not really questioning it enough because they couldn't necessarily see all of the areas that it was in. So they might be affected by the employment one, but not by the accommodation, or they might, but then when they see that it's actually happening in health, education, driving, like every single part of their life, then they start beginning to think, my goodness, what's all this about?
But it's more of an issue, I think, in England than it is to see in Scotland.
Yeah, because this isn't law in Scotland.
No,
It's
and,
not
and I was speaking to a cousin of mine, so she was attacked in the park by somebody, and I found it really interesting. So she said, I said, was it she said it was an English person that attacked her, and she's also born in England.
Right.
And I thought to myself, so she's calling him an English person, but she's English herself. But she doesn't identify herself as being English.
I think you had to go somewhere which is sorry.
But that sense of belonging.
Yeah.
So even though you may have lived here for she's in her 60s now. she was born in this country, but she still doesn't see herself as
Yeah,
a
yeah.
I mean, you had a quote somewhere here, which I think is the ultimate irony, which is that at the end of the day, it is not stopping, it is not reducing illegal immigration.
Yeah, it's increasing
It is
it, yeah.
reducing migration. I
Yeah,
think that is the ultimate irony.
yeah, 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 yeah.
Yeah, I think, when we were talking about, sense of belonging, and when we were talking about it, and I found a kind of commonality, and I was thinking about, my children, if suddenly, Bangladesh, all the changes, suddenly 2 million people they became stateless in Assam, some
Yeah.
sort of changes may come. And if they find themselves vulnerable here, where do they go? I was thinking that way. But again, the sense of belonging, where do I belong? And
But this is a worldwide thing,
It's a
Yeah.
it's worldwide. I don't think about 500,000 or 200,000.
Italy needs
Yeah.
people.
Yeah?
Italy needs people.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny to think about Assam, think about the Rohingya and the borders, the effects.
I mean, immigration rule will vary. I mean, while Britain is going to get soon it's going to be a aging population.
Yeah.
So more pensioners will be there than the...
not necessarily, they're bringing in the...
I mean, a general trend, I'm talking about Europe, like Germany is this is what 1 million Syrian was given
Yeah.
right to apply back, she's done a very good job, but she's losing her post now because of 1 million Syrians. Because German, she knows that there is a balance of working and retirement issue there.
Yeah.
So there is a workforce needed there. So she kind of said, okay, these people, I mean, 1 million. This is you have to do it all of the time. There's a balancing issue, like aging population and working, and that is the main fact of the immigration. That is, you have to get it right, otherwise it will.
Yeah, that's, if you look at India, how do you redress the historical injustices? For example, Tripura, the state in Tripura, was 75% tribal people in 1947. Persecuted Bengali Hindus from what is now Bangladesh went there, and now it is 75% Bengalis and 25.
Yeah.
And it has happened
Yeah.
in our lifetime.
Yeah.
But how do you then make value judgment? A group persecuted going there, settling, removing the indigenous people.
Well, we just have to not think that it's always going to stay the same, because the thing about borders is that they're always changing. I mean, if you think about East and West Germany, like 15 years before the Berlin Wall came down and the Iron Curtains came down, who would have imagined that it was going to?
But there was one thing which is different. They were ethnically and religiously same.
Yeah.
When Hindus are displacing tribal people, they are not ethnically same.
But then
that is the problem in Germany, because if they were Roman Catholics rather than Protestant, things would have been different.
But then,
as in Ireland.
But then what I'm saying is that all of the borders around, the USSR, they kind of, changed after all of that. So what I'm saying is just that things are changing the whole time. And with climate change, what's going to happen? I mean, I just keep on having this image of Bangladesh like surrounded by the fence from India and the water moving up and all of the people, and what are you going to do about that?
I mean, people joke about it in Bangladesh in the sense that it's terrible for Bangladesh, but Maldives will go down before us, so we'll have to worry.
People always find a way. People will always.
This is kind of, I had when my early 25 years after or 50 years after Bangladesh part of Bangladesh will go. This is climate change is under nobody's control. We can't worry about it.
But the borders are not going to hold back people. The fences are not going to
climate change, something will happen, whether we like it or not. Obviously the Greenpeace and all these are making this big demonstration at the moment. But it is, climate change is, you can control here, but Bangladesh is still will produce the big pollution. Because India is developing now, China is developing. British is, they can do things. They can spend the money in China to do the pollution things, all the factory pollution proof and all this. So you did it now, and what's wrong with us doing it now? Because we need to do it.
Bangladesh, the rivers are being taken over. I mean, somebody said that Bangladeshis are so innovative that if they had a chance, they would sort of take over, Bay of Bengal. I mean, the rivers, you can do something on rivers. I can understand about industrialization. But why are the rivers being taken away? Literally taken away.
The India, Bangladesh, in a way, is a very fertile land. Bangladesh, so many rivers run through Bangladesh. If like a real, look at Holland. Holland is under the water, but it's surviving. So Bangladesh has got more potential if they can use if they can use the river properly, irrigate system and properly use it.
Lands are being lost in the river.
Then this problem.
Yeah, but we got this use like monsoon and all this river, climate change and everything. It has potential, but you have to, obviously Bangladesh has got too much population, that's a big issue. But we got so many rivers, and rivers used to do trade. River was motorway before. Nowadays motorway. Used to be motorways, river used to be motorways.
Yeah.
Just one thing, this is my personal view based on my experience and what I have observed, but it can always change, with new development. I think the present borders that exist is going to be very difficult to change, right? In the near future. With USSR, they call it Soviet Union, and then all these other states that Russia conquered in the past, and they brought them under Soviet. And then they declared independence, and Soviet Union was weak, they couldn't do anything. But Russia is quite strong, so people will fight unless they become weak, or a stronger nation going invades, divides the country up. I personally think Saudi Arabia is going to be divided, right, by internal civil war, and then external intervention in the future, but not so. I could be wrong. So, because nation state, they will fight for their borders, and they will kill and marginalize people who want equal rights, who don't want to be dominated. Like, for example, Kashmir and Papua in Indonesia, Papua, and Chittagong Hill Tract, Bangladesh, Hawaii, right? It's all over the world.
But then look at other small countries in the EU, like Latvia, Estonia, the ex-USSR ones that are on the European side rather than the Central Asian side, who joined the EU in order to have be part of something which is larger, without borders.
No, that's a different thing.
No, but it's still a bordering process, but in a different direction.
All right, I know what you mean. That's like consensual, right, agreement to allow more. Because just tell you one thing. First time I went outside Bangladesh to India was in 2001, and then same time I also went to a couple of weeks later. I went to Thailand and Malaysia. And what I observed is that when I was traveling by bus, from Dhaka to Kolkata, new service introduced, but there was no real Dhaka to Kolkata service. You have to go to the border and wait until the morning. And it's such a big hassle crossing, and then some other bus picks you up. And the whole thing was a nightmare. But when I was taking the train from Malaysia, when we crossing to Thailand, train stop, some people come, stamp you on the train, then you get up, you just walk through and get on the same train. It just took a few minutes. So you have through agreement you can make things so kind of easy.
You have to be friendly relationships with your bordering country.
Like from Singapore, you can go all the way to Bangor by train, through Malaysia. It's about 30 hours or something.
Bangladesh should just join India again, Should just go back to India.
Well, it's happening.
No, it happened in Moitri.
It probably would be better, if India, Pakistan, Bangladesh all just join back, went back.
Oh, we have communication, real communication.
No, as a single
Get rid of the
country.
border.
I said that once when I was teaching about like water politics and the Faraka barrage, and about how it was much easier when it was a single country rather than lots of different countries. And I had a student, and he accused me of being part of the Indian intelligence service.
Was it a Pakistani that
Yes,
was part
it
of that was part of the army? Maybe his dad
I
was
don't know,
in
he
the
was
army.
Pakistani, and he said, you're in RAW, and I didn't know what RAW was. And then I
Yeah,
found
yeah.
out, and it was because he thought I was talking about that Pakistan and Bangladesh had become part of India.
Yeah, no, that's what it is.
Yeah.
So I'm
I just
Pakistani.
took a break about water. Well, thank you very much, everybody, for spending your Wednesday evening listening to this, and for me to hear your views and everything as well. Because I mean, this is such a huge issue that impacts on millions of people all over the world in different ways.
It's only going to get worse.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's only going to get worse.
Yeah.